Justice doesn't always end in a courtroom. Sometimes it catches up with people in the darkest corners of prison walls. In this video, we'll explore 5 disturbing cases of killers who met a violent end behind bars. These are the real stories of murderers who were murdered in prison. It was July 22nd, 1991, in Milwaukee, Wisconsin. Jeffrey Dahmer, a 31-year-old factory worker, lived in his apartment for over a year. That evening, Dahmer met 32-year-old Tracy Edwards, who unknowingly led police to Dahmer's horrifying secret. This discovery shocked the world, uncovering a level of wickedness many couldn't imagine. Dahmer's name became synonymous with evil due to his crimes between 1978 and 1991. He murdered 17 men, targeting vulnerable individuals, many from marginalized communities. Dahmer lured his victims by offering money or drinks, only to kill them in his small apartment. What horrified people wasn't just the murders, but what he did after. He dismembered his victims, kept body parts as trophies, and even ate some of their flesh. This earned him the names the Milwaukee Cannibal and the Milwaukee Monster. Born on May 21, 1960 in Milwaukee, Dahmer wasn't always considered dangerous. He was described as a happy child, but his personality changed after surgery at age 4. He became quiet and withdrawn, and his behavior became more troubling by his teenage years. He developed a fascination with dead animals, collecting bones and preserving carcasses. This morbid interest only grew as he got older. Dahmer committed his first murder in 1978, shortly after high school. He picked up Stephen Hicks, a hitchhiker, brought him to his parents' home, and killed him. Dahmer later explained he didn't want Hicks to leave, so when he tried to, Dahmer struck him with a barbell and strangled him. He dismembered the body and disposed of it in the woods near his home. This was the beginning of Dahmer's violent urges, though nearly a decade passed before he was killed again. From 1987 to 1991, Dahmer's killing spree escalated. He preyed on young men and boys, meeting them at gay bars, bus stops or malls. His victims were often from the fringes of society, whose disappearances went unnoticed for a while. He lured them to his apartment, drugged them, strangled them, and carried out disturbing acts afterward. He kept body parts like skulls and hearts, and took photographs of his victims at different stages of the process, allowing him to relive his crimes. The details of Dahmer's actions were deeply disturbing. He conducted gruesome experiments, attempting to create a zombie by drilling into his victims' skulls and injecting chemicals into their brains. These attempts always failed. In some cases, Dahmer ate parts of his victims' bodies, further adding to the horror when these details became public. Dahmer's reign of terror ended on July 22, 1991. Tracy Edwards managed to escape Dahmer's apartment after being lured there for drinks. Dahmer had tried to handcuff him, but after a struggle, Edwards fled and flagged down police. They returned to Dahmer's apartment and found evidence beyond their worst nightmares: photos of dismembered bodies, a skull in the refrigerator, and body parts in the freezer. Dahmer was arrested, and over the following weeks, he confessed to killing 17 people, providing horrifying details of each crime. Dahmer's trial took place in early 1992. Despite the heinous nature of his crimes, Wisconsin had abolished the death penalty in 1853. So Dahmer was sentenced to 15 consecutive life sentences, later increased to 16. This meant he would spend the rest of his life in prison. Dahmer expressed a desire for death, but the court's decision was final. He would remain in jail for life. In prison, Dahmer was kept in protective isolation for his safety. His crimes made him a target, and prison officials knew that other inmates might try to harm him. Despite these precautions, Dahmer's behavior in prison was disturbing to both inmates and staff. He made grotesque jokes, even shaping his food into body parts. His actions only deepened the hostility toward him. On November 28, 1994, Dahmer's life came to a violent end. While on cleaning duty with 2 other inmates, Jesse Anderson and Christopher Scarver, Scarver attacked Dahmer with a metal bar, striking him twice in the head. Dahmer was rushed to the hospital, but died shortly after. Scarver later claimed that correctional officers had intentionally left them alone, knowing what would happen. While this was never confirmed, many suspect prison staff may have turned a blind eye to Dahmer's murder. After Dahmer's death, Public reactions were mixed. Some saw it as justice, while others, like the families of his victims, had more complex feelings. Rita Isbell, the sister of one of Dahmer's victims, expressed relief but didn't celebrate his death, acknowledging the pain he had caused her family without wishing for such an outcome. It was 1977 in Quebec, Canada. Roch Thériault, a man in his 30s, believed God had chosen him to lead people to salvation. Raised in a strict religious home, Thériault became obsessed with the Old Testament and dropped out of school early. He believed the world would end in a battle between good and evil. To prepare for this, he converted to the Seventh-day Adventist Church and followed their strict lifestyle. He gave up alcohol, tobacco, and unhealthy foods. But this didn't last. Thériault was persuasive and gathered a group of followers through religious seminars. They quit their jobs and formed a commune called the Ant Hill Kids, a name inspired by their hard work. By 1977, Thériault had convinced his followers that he was Moses, guiding them toward a sin-free society. However, the promise of a peaceful community soon turned into something dark. Initially, the group lived peacefully, selling baked goods to make a living. But over time, Thériault's behavior changed. He began drinking again and imposed strict rules on his followers. He prevented them from speaking to their families and limited communication within the group unless he was present. Those who disobeyed faced severe punishment, including being beaten, suspended from the ceiling, or having their hair plucked out. His punishments grew more brutal as his mental state worsened. Thériault predicted the world would end in 1979 and moved his group deep into the Quebec wilderness. Isolated from society, they waited for the apocalypse. But when it didn't happen, Thériault claimed that time worked differently in God's world. This explanation kept his followers loyal. Despite the failed prediction, Thériault maintained control through violence and fear. Living in the wilderness, Thériault's cruelty escalated. He spied on his followers and punished those he felt weren't loyal. He forced them to break their legs with sledgehammers, eat insects and rats, and burn themselves on stoves. Even the children weren't spared, as they were nailed to trees and stoned by other children. No one was safe from his sadistic behavior. One of the worst incidents occurred when Thériault performed a crude surgery on a woman complaining of stomach pain. Using kitchen tools and a blowtorch, he cut open her abdomen and removed part of her intestines. She died the next day in agony. Thériault then attempted a bizarre resurrection by drilling a hole into her skull. This horrifying act didn't bring her back to life, but his followers remained devoted to him. Despite the horrors happening in the commune, the outside world knew little. Thériault fathered 26 children with his followers, and even though authorities eventually removed the children from the commune, the adults stayed behind. His reign of terror might have continued if not for one woman, Gabrielle Lavallée. Gabrielle endured years of abuse, including having teeth pulled and suffering severe burns. She tried to escape but returned out of fear. Her breaking point came when Thériault amputated her arm with a hunting knife after cutting off her finger and nailing her hand to a table. Fleeing the commune, Gabrielle contacted authorities, finally ending Thériault's control. In 1989, police raided the commune, rescuing the remaining followers and arresting Thériault. He was charged with numerous crimes, including the murder of Solange Boilard, the woman who died from his botched surgery. Thériault was sentenced to life in prison in 1993 after testimonies from former followers revealed the full extent of his brutality. In 2011, Thériault met a violent end in prison. His cellmate handed a knife to a guard and confessed to killing him. Thériault's body was found mutilated, ending his life in the same violent manner he inflicted on others. Even after his death, some of Thériault's followers remained loyal, visiting him in prison. His dark legacy lives on, haunting those who survived his reign of terror. On May 21, 1924, Chicago was shaken by a crime that shocked the nation. Two wealthy young men, Nathan Leopold and Richard Loeb, ages 19 and 18, believed they were intellectually superior to others. Influenced by philosopher Friedrich Nietzsche, they saw themselves as above the law and wanted to prove it by committing the perfect crime. What followed was one of the most brutal and infamous murders in Chicago's history. Leopold and Loeb were more than just friends. they shared a close intellectual bond. Both were academically gifted. Leopold had just graduated from the University of Chicago and planned to attend Harvard Law, while Loeb studied history at the same university. Despite their success, they craved something more that would set them apart. Together, they devised a plan to murder an intellectual challenge. Their motive wasn't revenge or financial gain, but simply to prove they could get away with it. They believed they were supermen, beyond moral consequences. After months of planning, they chose their victim, 14-year-old Bobby Franks, a distant relative of Loeb. On May 21st, they lured Bobby into their car, promising him a ride home. What followed was a cold and calculated murder. Though it's debated who struck the fatal blow, the pair killed Bobby and disposed of his body in a remote area, believing they had committed the perfect crime. To further mislead investigators, Leopold and Loeb sent a ransom note to Bobby's parents, demanding money for his safe return. However, their plan quickly fell apart. Bobby's body was found the next day, and a mistake at the crime scene sealed their fate. Leopold had accidentally dropped his glasses. These were no ordinary glasses. They had a unique hinge, and only a few pairs had been sold in Chicago. When the police traced them back to Leopold, he couldn't explain how they ended up at the crime scene. Under pressure, both Leopold and Loeb confessed, revealing that they viewed the murder as an intellectual exercise, a way to prove their superiority over others. The crime horrified the public. The idea that two privileged young men could kill an innocent child purely for the thrill of it was beyond comprehension. The media dubbed it the crime of the century. The trial became a national sensation. When the trial began in July 1924, it was clear that the evidence against them was overwhelming. Their lawyer, Clarence Darrow, took a different approach. Rather than trying to prove their innocence, he aimed to spare them from the death penalty. Darrow argued that Leopold and Loeb weren't fully responsible for their actions, citing their privileged upbringing and exposure to intellectual ideas they couldn't fully grasp. Darrow's defense resonated with the judge, and in the end, both men were sentenced to life in prison plus 99 years, avoiding the death penalty. They were sent to separate prisons, and their families disowned them. Loeb's time in prison was short-lived. He died in 1936 during a confrontation with another inmate. On the other hand, Leopold lived quietly behind bars, studying languages, teaching other inmates, and even publishing scientific papers. He was paroled in 1958 after serving 33 years and moved to Puerto Rico, where he lived out the rest of his life in obscurity, dying in 1971. The Leopold and Loeb case left an impact on American society. It raised questions about morality, justice, and the dangers of intellectual arrogance. The case also inspired many works in literature, theater, and film, including Alfred Hitchcock's 1948 movie Rope, based on their story. Nearly a century later, the case still fascinates people. It forces us to grapple with the uncomfortable truth of how intelligence and privilege can sometimes lead individuals to commit unimaginable acts. It was May 31st, 1964, in Tucson, Arizona. Charles Schmid, a 22-year-old man, was known for influencing the local teens. Despite his short height of 5 feet 3 inches, Schmid had an undeniable presence, earning him the nickname the Pied Piper of Tucson. He had a strange hold over the youth, especially young girls, but what most didn't know was that behind his charm lay violent tendencies. His true nature would eventually lead to some of the most horrifying crimes Tucson had ever seen. Schmid was born on July 8, 1942, and adopted by Charles and Catherine Schmid, who ran a nursing home in Tucson. While they provided a stable home, Schmid had a tense relationship with his father, and his parents' eventual divorce affected him deeply. He didn't perform well in school, though he did excel in gymnastics, leading his team to a state championship in 1960. However, in his senior year, he quit the team and later got suspended for stealing tools from a class, marking the end of his education. Without a diploma or job, Schmid moved into a small home on his mother's property, relying on a $300 monthly allowance she gave him. He began spending his time driving around Speedway Boulevard, trying to attract girls. To appear taller and more imposing, he wore shoe lifts, dyed his hair black, and even drew a fake mole on his face to resemble his idol, Elvis Presley. His unusual style and personality made him popular among local teens despite being in his 20s. On May 31, 1964, Schmid took a dark turn. Along with his girlfriend Mary French and his friend John Saunders, he lured 15-year-old Aline Rowe into a dangerous situation. Schmid convinced French to ask Rowe for a double date, with Saunders as her partner. Unaware of their true intentions, Rowe agreed to join them. The group drove to an isolated desert area outside Tucson. Once there, Schmid attacked Rowe, committing a terrible assault before hitting her with a rock. Knowing what would happen, French stayed in the car, listening to music while the crime unfolded. Afterward, Schmid and Saunders buried Rowe's body in the desert, thinking they had covered their tracks. Rowe's disappearance went unsolved for over a year. Her mother, Norma Rowe, reported her missing, but the police believed she had run away, as many teenagers did at the time. Without any leads or evidence, the case grew cold. However, Schmid couldn't keep quiet. He bragged about the crime to his friends, including Richie Bruns, who was disturbed by what he heard. Schmid's influence was so strong that even though many people knew about the crime, no one reported it. One of his friends later commented, "Everyone knew, but by then, it was too late to speak up." But this wasn't Schmid's last crime. In 1965, Schmid began dating 17-year-old Gretchen Fritz, whose father was a well-known heart surgeon. When their relationship turned sour, Gretchen threatened to expose Schmid's role in Rowe's death. Schmid couldn't risk that, so on August 16, 1965, he took drastic action. That night, Schmid strangled both Gretchen and her 13-year-old sister Wendy and hid their bodies in the desert. Just like before, their disappearance was initially ignored by the authorities, who assumed the girls had run away. Once again, Schmid confessed his crimes to Bruns and even showed him where he had buried the bodies. Fearing for his own girlfriend's safety, Bruns fled Tucson and told his family about the murders. They convinced him to contact the police, and when Bruns provided details about the crimes, Schmid was arrested in November 1965. Schmid's arrest made national headlines, and the media nicknamed him the Pied Piper of Tucson. His trial for the murders of Gretchen and Wendy Fritz began in February 1966, drawing significant attention. Bruns testified, describing how Schmid had boasted about the killings and taken him to the burial sites. Schmid's lawyer tried to shift the blame to Bruns, but the jury wasn't convinced. After just 2 hours of deliberation, they convicted Schmid and sentenced him to death. While awaiting execution, Schmid faced trial for Rowe's murder and eventually pleaded guilty to second-degree murder. He was sentenced to 50 years to life for that crime. However, in 1971, Arizona abolished the death penalty, commuting Schmid's sentence to life in prison. Schmid's time in prison was turbulent. He made several escape attempts, briefly succeeding in 1972 before being recaptured. His behavior in prison didn't win him many allies, and on March 10, 1975, 2 inmates attacked him with knives, severely injuring him. Schmid died from his injuries on March 30, 1975, bringing an end to his violent life but leaving behind a legacy of horror in Tucson. It was October 1st, 2011, in Frankland Prison, one of the UK's most secure prisons. Mitchell Harrison, a 23-year-old inmate, was serving an indefinite sentence for a horrific crime. He had lured a 13-year-old girl to his apartment and committed terrible acts, leading the courts to declare him a significant risk to young girls. However, what happened to Harrison in prison was something no one could have predicted. 2 inmates, Nathan Mann, 24, and Michael Parr, 33, were also in Frankland, serving life sentences for their violent crimes. Together, they carried out an attack on Harrison that shocked both prison staff and the public. Harrison's criminal record began when he was 13, after an assault on a 7-year-old girl. At 15, he was back in court for threatening another girl in his class. These disturbing patterns led to his eventual conviction for the assault of the 13-year-old, which put him behind bars indefinitely, with a minimum sentence of 4.5 years. Frankland Prison is a Category A facility housing some of the most dangerous criminals in the UK, including murderers and violent offenders. In this high-security environment, Harrison crossed paths with Mann and Parr, both men with dark and violent tendencies. Nathan Mann was particularly dangerous. Known for his fantasies about violence and even cannibalism, Mann had been serving a life sentence for a brutal double murder. He had killed 2 elderly women in a nursing home in 2007. During his time in prison, he had confessed to staff that he wanted to carry out the goriest killing they had ever seen. Michael Parr, his accomplice, also had a violent past. He was convicted of attempted murder in 2003 after trying to suffocate a hospital patient. Both men bonded over their shared violent tendencies. On the morning of October 1st, Mann and Parr lured Mitchell Harrison into Mann's cell. There they attacked him. Parr held Harrison down while Mann used homemade weapons, a razor blade melted into plastic and a pen, to carry out the assault. The attack was swift and brutal. The 2 inmates had planned to remove Harrison's liver and consume it, but did not follow through with this plan. When prison officers discovered Harrison's body, it was too late. His injuries were severe, and the scene was so disturbing that even experienced guards were shaken. Mann calmly informed a guard about the body in the cell. Mann and Parr showed no remorse when asked why they did it, merely shrugging their shoulders. Despite the brutal nature of Harrison's crime, the question remains, how did something like this happen inside a secure prison? Both Mann and Parr had clear histories of violence, yet they were left unsupervised with a vulnerable inmate. Even though Harrison had committed terrible acts, there are questions about the safety measures within the prison system. Should inmates like Mann and Parr, known for their violent fantasies, have been allowed near other prisoners? After the murder, Mann and Parr were charged and convicted of killing Harrison. During their court hearings, neither offered much explanation. They admitted to planning the murder, simply saying they felt like doing it. In court, Mann's defense claimed that his actions were influenced by a psychological disorder that reduced his responsibility for the crime. However, both he and Parr received additional life sentences. Judge Justice Openshaw described the crime as ghastly and gruesome, adding that neither Mann nor Parr would likely ever be released, as they posed an ongoing danger to society. This case raised many concerns about how a brutal murder could occur inside one of the most secure prisons in the UK. Mann and Parr had made their violent intentions clear, yet they were still able to carry out their deadly plan. Their calm and calculated behavior after the murder only added to the horror of the situation, showing a lack of remorse and chilling indifference to the crime they had just committed.